The dead girl from the lake. All names, titles, and events are fictitious. Any coincidences are coincidental. Sir Thomas Henry took off his steel-rimmed spectacles and wrinkled his nose myopically. With a graceful, probably years-honed movement, he took out of his jacket pocket a handkerchief with a modest conservative monogram in the corner and leisurely wiped the glasses. Checked for light, breathed, and wiped again. Put the glasses back on his nose and sniffed, sniffing. Not good. The smell and the sight didn't satisfy him at all. He turned his gaze to the woman standing next to him. Her lush, brown hair favored the whiteness of the delicate skin of her almost round face. Her stance, too, of course, was a little different from the conservative, aristocratic condition, not gaunt at all. But what thighs, especially to the touch. Breasts, in general, you can't take your eyes off. The neckline of the elegant road dress did not so much conceal as expose, to the envy of others, what now belonged not so much to Mrs. Thomas Henry as to him. He swallowed involuntarily. On top of that, a very nice open smile. Yes, he has her, a beauty. Such a wonderfully found charm, untouched by a childish, almost sanctimonious notion of her family's highness. I wish she were dead to her. Frames. This very highness. Embodied charm. My dear, Sir Henry said to the new Mrs. Thomas Henry. I beg your pardon for the somewhat, uninhabited appearance of our, so to speak, ancestral nest. The fact is, I haven't lived here, if my memory serves me correctly. Yes, since Uncle Randall's funeral. That's 9 years. Of course, since then, things have been... It's a bit of a mess. But I hope you'll help Murchison and me fix up this gloomy place and turn it into a cozy family nest. The wife of 2 months standing, Caroline, as she called herself in American parlance, Van Eyck, pulled out her cosmetic bag while her husband was working on his optics. But unlike him, she was trying, by powdering and touching up her makeup, to cheer herself up, since her ruddy and cheerful face did not need any improvement. But her soul certainly needed a timeout, so the answering smile was a bit strained. The sight of this sullen, dirty black ruin, which her husband called, almost proudly, the nest, did nothing to lift her spirits. Quite the opposite. Even she could see at a glance that the castle was very old and neglected. And even the ivy which covered its well-preserved facade with a bright green cloth did nothing to brighten the impression of neglect and boredom. Yes, it must be terribly boring in this rural hinterland, both during the day and in the long, gloomy evenings overhanging the plain. And at night, she imagined the howls of some descendant of the Baskervilles' dog. The nearest village which they passed on their way here consisted of only 10 or 12 huts built of the same local stone, only lightly worked, bonded with lime, darkened by rain and time. And its black and dreary appearance did not encourage the desire to overcome the 2 miles separating it from the castle. Of course, the monolith of the castle could not be called huge with full right. But it was not a small structure either. The width of the facade was no less than 60 yards. In height, however, the structure resembled a slightly remodeled medieval fortress and had only 2 floors, but they were very high. It would not be easy to heat the 5-yard-high chambers on winter evenings, Caroline thought. Of course, paying tribute to the traditions of architecture and aristocracy, the front of the castle faced a welcoming lawn with a fountain, around which the driveway ran, and the trees of the old park stood sparsely and shaded almost nothing. In the depths, however, behind the castle, the tops of a thick and not too well-maintained, almost forest could clearly be seen on the left side of the structure. On the right side, dense thickets of reeds and bushes concealed something like a small lake. Perhaps the remains of a defensive moat around the possessions of ancient feudal lords. The tall doors, made of old and also almost black oak, shuddered and creaked. One of the doors opened slowly and solemnly, revealing the same haunting blackness. As if materializing out of the void, a grotesquely straight figure appeared in the doorway, and an elderly man stepped down the steps. His posture and gait, practiced over the years, would have told her who he was, even if he wasn't wearing a perfectly fitting and nearly new livery. My dear, Sir Thomas hesitated slightly, letting the butler approach. Let me introduce Murchison, our family butler, so to speak. Murchison is Mrs. Thomas Henry. She is now the full mistress of Big Lake. Sir Thomas looked back at the cab driver, who had already unloaded 5 suitcases, 2 bags, and a hat box from the trunk, and hastened to add, Murchison, be kind enough to call Hans and order him to carry our luggage into the rooms. Murchison, to whom the newfound mistress smiled politely and a little apprehensively, bowed deeply, and only when he straightened up did he reply in an unexpectedly deep voice, giving his tone its due share of solemnity.
"It is a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Thomas Henry."
"I shall be honored to serve such a charming mistress." He turned to his master, and in a much more restrained voice said, "Yes, sir. I'll give orders immediately," and then he made an inviting gesture to let the guests into the castle. The newlyweds entered, climbing 3 wide but badly crumbled steps. Sir Thomas tried to cheer up his wife's obviously low spirits by proudly announcing, "This castle was begun in the year 1464. It was not finished until 40 years later. You know, darling, I can easily believe that. If you'd told me it had been standing since the Normans..."
"What do you mean?"
Did. The unconcealed disappointment with the family nest was evident not only in the tone of the new mistress, but also in the nervous movement of her chiseled shoulder. Murchison closed the door after them and then rang a bell on a 3-legged table, which looked more like a bookcase. Almost immediately, a maid in a white and perfectly starched apron appeared. Myra. Murchison's tone was proud and pleased, as if he had chosen such a beautiful wife for his master. "Show Mrs. Thomas Henry and Sir Henry to their apartments." Murchison left, apparently to call Hans for help, and the maid bowed politely. "How do you do, my lady?" Then, without embarrassment, she fixed her eyes on the young woman with eyes that sparkled with genuine interest. However, Caroline was not offended. In Myra's gaze was also read undisguised admiration. It was obvious that the new mistress made an impression. Impression. The girl's voice was sonorous. "Right this way, Mrs. Henry." "And you, sir." She led them up the right-hand side of the monumental and pompously balustraded grand staircase to the 2nd floor. Caroline found herself genuinely surprised. Here, it was noticeable that a caring woman's hand had touched the rarities in the family halls in order to give everything, if not cozy, then at least the feeling that you, not in a museum. If in the hallway was dark and quiet, and there was a distinct odor of dust of centuries, then on the 2nd floor the feeling that people still lived here overpowered the general impression of neglect. There was no dust anywhere, not even on the antique halberds and muskets hanging on the walls. There was even a faint smell of polishing compound in the air, something with wax and rosin. Yes, damn it, Caroline noted that the antique, matte gloss oak paneling that lined the hallway up to mid-height looked great, though a little dark, of course. Perhaps the remains of a defensive moat around the possessions. Myra led them down a wide corridor to the right wing of the castle. It made a sharp turn in the middle. Yes, that's right. The castle was built in the shape of a U, and then continued for another 40 yards. The couple's rooms, however, were almost in the middle of the side wing, and they didn't have to go that far. Caroline's sitting room was bright and cozy. The walls had recently been papered with new wallpaper in a light green color, and the garlands of wildflowers looked good on them. The high ceiling spoiled the overall impression. The almost square room was obviously larger in height than in length and width. The huge fireplace on the side wall had recently been whitewashed, and with its nearly 2-yard-long dark yawn, it made the room look conservative, as if to counterbalance the frivolous colors of the wallpaper. A sofa and 2 armchairs, quite in the style of the last century, with curved and carved legs and backs, made up the interior. The fabric of the upholstery matched the wallpaper. The antique bureau in the corner, however, had certainly not been restored, and the black tarnished wood stood alone. In stark contrast to the overall solemn and antique spirit, a huge modern television screen hung opposite the sofa, and speakers stood in the corners. Caroline, on a vague hunch, walked over and tapped the wall with her knuckles. Sir Henry, who was watching with a half-smile, confirmed her guess. "Quite right, my dear. It's all freshly planked and then wallpapered. And the old blackened carved oak would only add to the gloom of your boudoir. Well, you remember what it's like in the hallway, don't you? Shall we see the bedroom?" Whatever the young woman thought of this strange treatment of her ancestral possessions, she kept it to herself, walking into the bedroom with a confident, easy gait. Blatant barbarism. On the other hand, it was nice to know that they were trying to make her feel comfortable. And a cheerful mood. Because if here, and really, The walls remained as in the corridor. "At least guard!" shout. The bedroom was much larger, at least 7 yards long. It was decorated with wallpaper already in blue, with sea motifs, mermaids, fish, sailing ships. In the center of the far wall stood a monumental curtsy to the era of Queen Victoria. A massive and very wide bed under a high canopy, covered on all sides with gas curtains. To the side of the bed was a door to what the young woman immediately thought was her husband's bedroom. The second partition was occupied by a painting, darkened by time and quite large, at least 1 yard wide and 2 yards high. The ornately carved frame, and the figure vaguely visible on it, were completely blackened, though the carving itself was magnificent. For centuries, the rest of the furniture was in the spirit of the boudoir, with bent and carved legs, backs, and armrests. The dressing table was no smaller than the dining table. It would hold all the boxes and bottles Caroline had brought, and there was room to lie down herself, if she so desired. True, the mirrors might not be so dim, but as her husband, seeing her interest, said proudly, "Real Venetian." Well, what do you say, my dear? The carpenters and decorators have worked hard for 2 months for a reason? There was genuine pride in Sir Henry's tone. He had indeed endeavored to brighten her involuntary confinement, if only with joyful tones and exoticism, but with modern conveniences. Yes, it was the bathroom, not Sir Henry's bedroom, that was behind the door by the bed, and it was beautifully appointed. There was a swimming pool, a shower, a sink with all the shelves and a lighted mirror. The green-blue tile walls and floor were mosaicized in the style of Greco-Roman baths. Everything would have been perfect, but the view was somewhat spoiled by a huge water heater that occupied one of the corners. Although it was painted to match the color of the tiles, it didn't really fit in. Seeing his wife wrinkle her nose a little, Sir Thomas hastened to explain.